Hello, and welcome to Food Systems, a podcast from the Forum for the Future of Agriculture, where we discuss ideas that can shape a sustainable food system, from farm to fork, from policy to consumers, and everything in between. I'm your host, Robert de Graaf, and you can find us on Twitter at Forum for Ag. These episodes will be available every other week on all major platforms. Before we get started, we would like to say a quick thank you to the FFA founding partners, the European Landowners Organization and Syngenta, as well as the FFA strategic partners, Cargill, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the Nature Conservancy, Thought for Food, and the World Wildlife Fund. Please enjoy this episode. Hello, and welcome back to Food Systems. Today we're talking to Adele Jones. She's the Deputy CEO of the Sustainable Food Trust, and we'll be discussing true cost accounting. Adele, thank you so much for joining Food Systems today.
No problem. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for having me on.
One of the reasons we're talking to you is an article you co-authored in Nature in December 2020. We'll put a link to this in the show description so you can read it for yourself. I just wanted to start, can you give for our audience a brief overview of true cost accounting and how these models are put together?
Absolutely. So true cost accounting effectively is a new way of looking at how we value things and how we value the impact that a company, a person, or anyone might have. So effectively, true cost accounting doesn't just look at the kind of the traditional financial profit and loss of a company, let's say, but it also looks at the impact on the natural environment and public health and puts a value on those impacts and then factors it into the profit and loss effectively. So what you end up with is an adjusted profit and loss based on your financial performance, but also the impact on nature and health.
So this is very close to, we've had previous guests on this podcast to sort of ESG. Is that what we're talking about? Environmental, social, governance, but that's more in the corporate area. Is it to help everybody find out the true price of their production systems? Is that the area that we're in?
Absolutely. So it's similar to ESG. It's certainly a cousin of one of the solutions we need to run with, but I think true cost accounting is broader. By placing values on externalities, as you say, it means we can find the true cost of products because we're not just looking at the financial cost of producing that carrot, let's say, but we're also thinking about its environmental impact and its impact on people when they eat it, and of course the workers who produced it as well. And when you factor all those things into that cost, it either gives you an inflated cost because the environmental impact was higher than we realized, or the health impact was higher than we realized, or actually sometimes it can be lower because the environmental impact might have been very positive, and therefore you can kind of offset some of that cost because it was produced in a very positive way. So it's a really interesting discipline, and I think it's a massive part of the solution in terms of how we fix our food system going forward.
This is an area that's seen quite some development. I think the first encounter that I had of it was of quite a famous report done in 2012 by the TEEB group, which did this, try to put some value specifically on biodiversity assets. But that was in 2012. We're almost a decade later. How much closer do you think that we are to implementing something like true cost accounting?
I think in some ways we're closer, and the TEEB work stands for the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity for Agriculture and Food. Very long title, but does what it says on the tin, I suppose. It was a really kind of foundational report in terms of bringing all the experts around the world together and trying to think about how we value these natural assets and social assets and factor them into the cost of food. And I don't think the progress that's been made since then has been kind of exponential. I think what we've realized in the last 10 years, I suppose it almost is now, is that in a way perhaps we potentially put the cart before the horse with some of these true cost accounting frameworks, in that we're starting to gather an idea of how we value these natural, social, produced capital elements of food and farming. But what we didn't yet have was a common way of measuring those things on farm in the first place. So it's very difficult to start meaningfully valuing externalities, as economists call them, until you have a common way of measuring those external impacts in the first place. And we believe at the Sustainable Food Trust that common framework of measurement should begin at the farm, and it should be a suite of metrics and indicators which empower farmers to be part of the change, and so they can really easily see the steps of continuous improvement that they can take. If we start to collect all this information on things like soil health, biodiversity, water quality, air quality, all the way through to things like animal welfare, social capital, human capital, as we refer to them in true cost accounting world, you can start to get a real sense of the sustainability of that whole farming system. And then from that, you can then start to value those externalities and start to shift the balance of financial advantage towards farming in a way which promotes positive nature, mitigates against climate change, and produces food in a way which it contributes positively to public health and strong communities going forward.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how such assets should be valued. How does one assign, I suppose one of the easier things would be water, because water pollution is quite measurable. It's quite easily measurable as well. But how does one assign a value to biodiversity assets on a farm? And how does one compare the two? Let's say a small woodland with pheasants and butterflies in it versus a hedgerow versus a strip for butterflies. How does one assign monetary values to that?
It's really hard to do, to be honest, and I think biodiversity, I would argue, is probably the hardest category of things to value. And there's a whole conversation about, should we be valuing things like biodiversity? What is the true value of a butterfly or a pollinator? It's actually a really, really hard question to answer. But I suppose the counter to those arguments is that until we start to place a value on some of these things, companies and politicians won't act, because they won't necessarily see how important they are as part of our economy and part of our future well-being as a nation or a planet. And so you can kind of argue it both ways, but I think the situation we're in with climate change and nature degradation, declining public health, obviously that's front and center given the situation we've all been part of over the last couple of years. The situation is so severe now that I think if we don't start to value these assets, and that politicians and business leaders don't start to understand that they are actually a fundamental part of our economy, but our wider well-being as a society going forward, then we won't be able to fix the problems fast enough. And so going back to your question of how you value biodiversity, there's a few different schools of thought, and I think there's some really interesting work being done to try and consolidate some of this thinking. You can, for example, think about, okay, what's the economic value of pollinators in a particular place? And you can think about that in terms of, okay, if we got rid of all pollinators, God forbid, how much human effort would have to go into effectively,
hand pollinating an orchard, or
manually pollinating an orchard, or some, I don't know, fancy robot or something that could do that. And the cost is just unthinkable. Another way of thinking about it is what people would pay, what they would pay for a kind of recreational place, or woodland or hedgerow, what they would pay to make sure that continues to stay there. Like how do they value that? How do they value going for a walk around the lake at the weekend? What would they pay to go there and visit that place? And perhaps what would they pay to make sure that place didn't disappear? That's another way to think about it. It's a bit more subjective, but I think ultimately it's probably going to be a mixture of a few different things. And going back to the farm level metrics that we at the Sustainable Food Trust are really passionate about through a project called the Global Farm Metric, which is trying to create this common set of metrics for measuring whole farm sustainability. If we can start to get farmers all around the world measuring their biodiversity, whether it's directly measuring their biodiversity. For example, thinking about key indicator species that they see on their farm, birds, insects, etc. Or at the very least, just recording the practices that they are operating. So, for example, if farmers are using a herbal ley in a rotation as part of their cropping and livestock system, then you can, depending on what type of herbal ley, the length of the rotation, etc., you can derive a fairly accurate understanding of what the biodiversity benefit of that practice might be, based on literature, based on evidence, case studies. So it's a whole mixture of different things. I think we have to start measuring biodiversity to get a better sense of what good looks like in different parts of the world. We have to start understanding what the economic value of those things is based on a few different techniques, and then we have to sort of bring all those things together and come up with a way that policymakers and businesses can start supporting the transition to farming which is in harmony with nature and improves nature whilst producing healthy and nutritious food at the same time.
But this does presuppose a certain amount of existing both knowledge and time on the part of the farmer to do such recordings. Do you think that the average farmer in the UK or in Europe, let alone the developing world, I suppose, is that knowledge present? Is that sort of that time present for farms to do such a thing?
It's a really good question and a big consideration. And I would say in some situations, probably no. But I think we forget, particularly in kind of developed world nations with farmers, we forget how much farmers already do in terms of having to supply information to different sources. So, for example, their certification schemes, government grant applications, compliance requirements, carbon footprinting tools that their contracts might require them to do now, these sorts of things. And actually, when you start to look at that data, you realise that actually to do a whole farm sustainability assessment, it's much of the same stuff. And so if we can find a way of harmonizing the way we measure impact on farms, it doesn't actually mean that farmers have to collect the information again. It just means we need to draw it from the places that farmers are already sending information to. And of course, measurement techniques will change over time, technology will change over time, so we need to be kind of constantly evolving the way we measure things. But I think of course, there's some parts of the world where farmers are going to need real help, particularly in smallholder communities. But I actually don't think we have a choice. I think we have to start understanding the impact of farming and find ways to help farmers go on that journey.
This brings me to a related point. I'm quoting from the article in Nature. The idea of measuring and monetizing food system impacts is not about creating sellable assets. So if it's not about creating sellable assets or you are creating value categories, if these assets always remain theoretical and are not placed on a market, will they make a functional difference in biodiversity or water or any of the things that the desired outcomes that I think we'd all want in terms of a sustainable food system?
Yeah, so I see true cost accounting as a discipline or a toolkit which enables change to happen. So the implementation of true cost accounting within our economies throughout the world is not the end goal. The end goal is the things that will then lead to. So biodiversity restoration, improved water quality, improved air quality, more nutritious food, the list goes on. True cost accounting is effectively a means to reaching that end mission that we are all on. And so I think that quote where it says true cost accounting is not necessarily about creating sellable assets, I think what it's trying to say, it wasn't my quote, I don't think. I think what it's trying to say is that we are creating a discipline here which can then be used to drive further change towards our end goal. So I think from true cost accounting, you can obviously derive a value on sellable assets, for example, carbon that's locked up in soil or in trees, or biodiversity. And there is some initiatives now, as I'm sure your listeners are all well aware about, carbon trading, soil carbon trading, offsets tree planting, biodiversity net gain, these sorts of things. And I think we can, by valuing the externalities, I think we can use those mechanisms to drive positive change. But I think those sorts of new markets which are emerging, which I do think are really important, I think it makes it even more important that we're using common metrics to inform those new markets. Otherwise, I think it could be subject to a whole load of greenwashing, different schemes, having their own bespoke way of measuring impact, and how authentic that really is sometimes hard to know. So I think we all have to use the same metrics to measure change, and measurement is a means to doing other things and driving further change. So I think that's what that quote means. That's certainly my interpretation of it.
We already have significant numbers of farm data that do tell us certain long-term trends in terms of things not going very well. What does true cost accounting add to those metrics that we don't know, or and if it's implemented but not used, how does true cost accounting push this movement forward rather than just adding more numbers on top of an existing pile?
So true cost accounting effectively turns those numbers into a value, into a financial value that we recognise in economics, and what it means is that companies can then start to factor it into their P&L and balance sheet each year, and understand what they can do to drive change throughout their supply chains. It also means that policymakers can start factoring it into their budgets, and this is quite difficult because, as we all know, policymakers tend to operate on quite short time cycles, sort of 4 years or so. And actually, what we're thinking about here is how we can safeguard our environment for future generations to come. That's really long-term but crucial planning that needs to start being factored in. So what true cost accounting does is enables us to start to see the change that needs to happen in a slightly different way, and I suppose put it into a language which economists, policymakers and others can understand, how they can start to kind of make change happen, and start to really value the importance of those ecosystems in our economies, and that's not currently the case. So that's where true cost accounting comes into play. Yeah.
If I may summarize, sort of, if that's correct, you put a monetary value on the externalities, negative and positive, that we right now don't pay for. Is that a reasonable?
Yes, that's a good summary.
Okay. There's a different piece on your website, a study, I think, in 2019, where you showed that for every pound, I think it is in the shops, there's about 97 cents, pence, apologies, uncounted for externalities. Will we ever get to a point where then that turns into an actual true price, and therefore are we talking about doubling consumer prices?
Yes, that report, The Hidden Cost of UK Food, was really interesting, and I think was the first of its kind, really putting putting these true costs into a practical sense, and saying, that from a UK perspective, the food we are buying in the supermarkets is, as you say, effectively costing us £1 more than we realise. And just to break down some of those figures, for example, within that £1, it was about 25p environmental degradation, or natural capital degradation, 10p of biodiversity loss, 13p of production-related ill health, 37p of diet-related ill health, and then there was the rest of the money was made up of things like farm support payments, research, and imports. So actually, what consumers pay at the till is not the true cost, and often we have no idea that we're paying for these, paying for the cleanup effectively in these other ways, which is kind of criminal when you start thinking about it.
Do you envision a world then where these costs are fully actualized, and we do say, or politicians do have to say, or the supermarkets are at some point forced to say, I'm sorry, but the loaf of bread that cost £1 is actually £2 because you, the consumer, have to pay for the lifestyle that you lead or the choices you make? Or is that a vision of the future?
I think it's an inconvenient truth that food is one of the only commodities that hasn't increased with inflation over the years. It now represents a much smaller part of our expenditure monthly than it used to. Obviously, there's so many other things we pay for now: mobile phones, Netflix subscriptions, whatever it might be. There's lots of other things which are an important part of our daily life now, and therefore food has been shrunk down into a smaller part of our spending. So we do need to think about food in a slightly different way now, but it is incredibly cheap, and as we've been talking about, it's not really cheap. The cheap food that we see in the supermarkets is actually costing us so much, and it might be costing us so much, but in the future, so it might be costing our children and grandchildren the right to go for a walk in the woodland that we love. And I think when you start thinking about that, you start to realise that the system is broken at the moment. But it doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't be thinking about, okay, if true cost accounting is really implemented by policymakers and by businesses, the cost of food might go up, particularly the cost of bad food, unhealthy food, food that's damaging the planet. And we do, of course, need to think about how that impacts low-income societies. I think there's some really interesting initiatives around the world. I really like the initiative in the US. I know it has its problems, but the Double Up Food Bucks initiative that I think was introduced in Washington, D.C., where food stamps were given out to people under a certain income threshold, but those food stamps were worth double if you spent them at the farmer's market. And I think things like that are really interesting. I think that there's some ways that I think government can step in to help bridge this gap, because everyone should have access to healthy, sustainable food. But I think we need to address the fact that at the moment, the way food is priced is not right, and the cheapest food is actually the most expensive, and it's just something we need to face.
No, I think that's certainly true, but this way of doing it with true pricing and then encouraging people to have the right food, it does have a sort of dirigiste way of doing it, because what you're doing as a society or as a government or as a multinational corporation is saying to people, being prescriptive and saying this is the food you should be eating and the other stuff is not. And that sort of seems to me to go against the current consumer economy that we have, where we just say, no, choice. It's all your choice.
Yeah, and I think it can be about choice going forward. I think increased transparency in our supply chains is going to be a thing that's happened. I think all big food companies, small food companies are thinking about the fact that generally consumers want to know more about where their food is coming from now. And there's obviously some really amazing technologies and techniques starting to emerge where we could effectively make our supply chains totally transparent from where that food, the exact farm that food came from and the journey it's been on to get to us buying it in the shops. And I think if we can make that process super transparent, and again have common metrics for communicating the impact to consumers, for example, the impact on nature, the impact on climate, the impact on health and well-being, I think it can then be about choice, because you can see, okay, let's say it ends up being a traffic light system. You can see that, that apple is actually all green. I can see that it cost a little bit more because let's say it was from an organic system, but I can see that's having a really important impact positively on nature, climate, health. So I'm going to buy that one rather than the one that's all orange. So I think it can be about choice, but I think it's also about giving people more information upon which to make decisions.
I mean, a lot of this very much depends on a deep political will to engage with the levers of the food system to really make fundamental changes in a way that a lot of people haven't seen for decades, I think, in their own sort of consumer choices. Do you think the will to politically engage is there at the moment to really tackle this issue, either on the UK level or even globally? We've just had the UN Food System Summit.
I think the political will is starting to emerge. I think what we need to remember with politicians is that they will only act when they feel the pressure from the public, because really they're thinking about polls at the end of the day. They're thinking about what's going to win them the next election. So if we, as a community of people working in food and farming and trying to affect this change, if we can find ways to shift public opinion in favour of transparency in supply chains, wanting to know the story behind their food, wanting to eat in a way which they know is contributing to the climate change solution and nature solution, etc. I think if we can start getting people to think in that way about, what can I eat to be part of the solution? What can I eat to be sustainable and healthy, and start to ask politicians those questions. I think that's what's going to drive the need for them to think about how sustainable food and farming really fits into the future economy. And that's where true cost accounting can really play a role. And there's a political term called the polluter pays principle, which is what we are advocating for in terms of negative externalities, accounting for negative externalities. And what it means is effectively those who contribute negatively to environmental degradation, negative public health outcomes, for example, the overuse of nitrogen fertilizer, which runs off into watercourses. Water companies are having to pay for the treatment of that. We're actually paying for it through our water bills. It's causing health impacts, it's causing biodiversity loss. If you factor all those costs back to source, overusing nitrogen fertilizer doesn't become a very good business case anymore. And that's where the polluter pays principle, if government can start to introduce that, I think that's really going to drive change very quickly.
But a lot of that, if you're talking about the actual point of where the negative externalities come from, is very often the farm. But we've spoken to a number of farmers on this podcast, and they say, well, we want to do better, we are trying to do better, but we have very limited economic choice in really reshaping our models because we simply don't have the money to get the latest technological updates that would allow us to reduce fertilizer use. So you would have to have substantial help to transform the farming sector as well, because otherwise you're just putting an extra financial burden on a sector that certainly in the UK and I think across the world is really already in a very dire financial situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have always taken the approach at the Sustainable Food Trust of trying to think about this from the point of view of farmers. We're an organisation that's run by farmers, which is always great in kind of grounding how we view these things and the solutions. And just want to sort of emphasise that I don't think the current situation we're in is the fault of farmers at all. I think they have been following the business case. They're business people at the end of the day, and they have been following the economic signals that they've been given by the food industry and government, and that has been to produce as much food as they possibly can at as low a possible cost, and that's because we're not costing the impacts that type of system has had over the years. And now we're starting to see this slightly differently. So I think what we need to do, as you really rightly pointed out, is effectively think about how we can make this transition to what we might call regenerative agriculture systems the no-brainer business models for farmers. It shouldn't be something which burdens them financially. It should be something that they see as an economic opportunity, and there should be means and ways of helping with that transition, because of course any transition is going to take a bit of time, it's going to be a bit disruptive, but it has to be the best business case for producing food, and the way to do that is by internalizing externalities back to the farm, making the practices which are causing negative impacts more expensive to do, and making the practices which cause positive impacts the most financially beneficial through government payments, but also through incentives from food companies who are sourcing from those farmers.
Well, speaking of transitions, the UK is currently developing its own new farm support systems after leaving the Common Agricultural Policy. Do you expect true cost accounting or similar strategies to play a role in that, or are you interacting with the UK government on bringing this about in this new ag support system, whatever it ends up being?
I think slowly but surely, yes. I don't think it's going to be quite as prominent as we might have hoped 10 years ago, but I think we're making small steps now. For example, in Wales, which is where I've spent quite a lot of time with the policy team recently, they are talking about introducing a nitrate vulnerable zone across the whole country, which effectively means kind of tighter regulation around the amount of nitrogen, both organic and inorganic, that you can put onto your farming system at different times of the year, making sure livestock are not too close to any watercourses, so manure doesn't kind of flow off into the rivers, because there's a huge issue with nitrogen pollution in Welsh rivers. So these sorts of things are kind of stepping stones to the full introduction of true cost accounting, and I think it's positive to see. There's obviously some upset in the farming community about these sorts of things because it's change, and they need to be, as we were talking about before, they need to be helped financially to make those changes. It shouldn't be something which is detrimental to them, but it's effectively the first iteration of the polluter pays principle coming into play, albeit just sort of by raising the regulatory floor. So I think we're getting there. I think the new schemes in the UK have a potential to be very positive. I think there's a bit of lack of ambition. I think we were very ambitious at the start, and we've slightly reverted back to thinking about farming and nature being two separate things which need to be incentivized, when actually the crux of what we need to do is put nature back into the centre of farming systems and make sure we find ways to farm in harmony with nature, rather than let's farm intensively on this bit of land and have nice nature on this bit of land. It's about let's put it all back together. That's how it's meant to be. That's how we use to produce our food. It's exciting, a long way to go, lots of hurdles still to climb, and lots of pressure needed on our politicians as ever.
Yeah. I wanted to ask the last question, which is the same we ask of everybody, which is if you had one policy suggestion or practical farm idea to make the food system more sustainable, what would it be?
Well, I think anyone that knows me knows that I am obsessed with measuring things, and I suppose that I'm cheating slightly because it's linked to the true cost accounting issue, but it goes back to what we were talking about before. We need farmers to start measuring impact, even if it's just one thing, measuring soil or measuring biodiversity. We just need to start getting an understanding of our baseline in terms of where we are right now, and from that we can work out where we need to get to. But if we just start to incentivize all farmers to start measuring their impact, I think it's going to inform so much policy decision making in future. And I can't really see that until we have that, we can get a full sense of where we need to go and how quickly. So that would be my sort of number one policy suggestion, is as part of the new schemes, as part of CAP reform, as part of the Farm Bill reform, introduce an annual sustainability assessment as part of those schemes, just to start collecting that data in a common way.
Adele Jones, Deputy CEO of the Sustainable Food Trust, thank you so much for joining Food Systems today.
No problem. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
You've been listening to an episode of Food Systems, a podcast brought to you by the Forum for the Future of Agriculture. Look for us in 2 weeks when we release our new episode. And in the meantime, please don't forget to subscribe on your podcast app, as well as on Twitter @ForumFag, for updates on this podcast, news, as well as FFA events. Please check out our website, www.forumforagriculture.com, for more great content. Thank you for listening and enjoy your day.